Sweat dripped onto cold steel as a $500,000 machine sat dead in the mud, threatening to bankrupt a fourth-generation farmer. 3 dealerships called it a lost cause. But one stubborn mechanic picked up his wrench, sparking a rebellion that brought 200 farmers straight to his barn door. October winds in Oak Haven, Iowa, didn't just blow. They carried the scent of desperate urgency. Winter was coming early, and for Arthur Pendleton, a 60-year-old farmer with deep lines etched into his weathered face, the frost meant financial ruin. He had 3,000 acres of unharvested corn and exactly one machine capable of pulling his massive grain carts through the increasingly muddy fields, a custom-modified Case Wine H. Steiger 600 quad track. It was a beautiful, terrifying beast of a machine. It cost him $500,000 financed to the hilt with the local bank, but on a freezing Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the north field, the beast roared, violently shuddered, and let out a sickening crack that echoed across the valley. Black smoke billowed from the exhaust stack, blinding warning lights flashed across the digital dashboard, and then utter, devastating silence. Arthur's heart plummeted into his stomach. He practically threw himself out of the cab, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The smell of scorched oil and melting plastic burned his nostrils. Within 2 hours, the pristine logo-emblazoned trucks of Sterling Ag Solutions arrived. Richard Sterling, the dealership owner who had a reputation for wearing a suit to a muddy field, stood back while his lead diagnostic technician, Blake Henderson, climbed up to the tractor. Blake was a young guy who had never planted a seed in his life, armed with a Panasonic Toughbook and a smug sense of authority. Blake plugged his proprietary diagnostic cable into the tractor's CAN bus port. He clicked his mouse a few times, scoffed, and shook his head. "She's dead, Artie," Blake said, not even bothering to look up from his screen. "Catastrophic failure in the main control unit. It sent a corrupted signal to the high-pressure common rail, dumped raw fuel into the cylinders, and hydro-locked the engine. The computer registered a fatal block fracture. The software permanently locked the powertrain for safety." Arthur felt his knees go weak. "Can you clear the code? Can we rebuild the top end?" Richard Sterling stepped forward, shaking his head with a practiced look of faux sympathy. "Arthur, this is a proprietary software lockout tied to a structural failure. Even if we replace the block, which would run you about 80 grand and take 6 months to ship from Germany, the computer won't let it start. It's a total loss. But look, I know you're in a bind. I can offer you $40,000 for it as scrap, and we can roll that into a lease on a brand new 9RX. I can have it delivered tomorrow." $40,000. Arthur's voice cracked. "I owe $400,000 on this machine, Richard. If I don't harvest by Friday, the bank takes the farm. You're telling me a computer glitch just killed my livelihood?" "It's not a glitch, it's a safety protocol," Blake interjected smoothly, packing up his laptop. "Sorry, man. You can't argue with the code." They drove away, leaving Arthur alone in the mud with a silent iron corpse. He sat against the massive rubber tracks and wept. It was over. 3 generations of Pendleton farming erased by a line of code and a broken piece of steel. But Arthur hadn't counted on the stubbornness of a man who owed his father a life debt. Caleb Montgomery lived on the outskirts of Oak Haven in a rusted-out Quonset hut surrounded by salvaged heavy machinery. At 62, Caleb was a ghost in the modern farming community. He was an old-school diesel mechanic from an era before microchips governed fuel injectors, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose ears were tuned to the mechanical heartbeat of an engine. 20 years ago, Arthur's father had co-signed a loan that kept Caleb out of prison and saved his shop. When Arthur's frantic wife called him, Caleb didn't say a word. He just hung up, threw a canvas bag of analog tools into the back of his beat-up Ford F-25. And drove to the north field. Caleb didn't bring a laptop. He didn't even look at the digital dash. He walked around the massive quad track, pressing his bare hands against the cold steel of the engine block. He unscrewed the oil fill cap, rubbed a drop of oil between his thumb and forefinger, and brought it to his nose. He spent an hour silently removing panels sliding under the massive undercarriage and tracing the wiring harnesses with a flashlight. Arthur watched him shivering in the cold, not daring to hope. Finally, Caleb slid out from under the beast. He wiped his hands on a rag, his face dark with grease and silent fury. "They lied to you, Arthur." Caleb growled, his voice like grinding gravel. Arthur blinked. "Blake showed me the computer readouts, Caleb. He said the block was cracked, hydro-locked." "Blake is a glorified typist," Caleb spat, throwing a heavy wrench onto the ground. "There ain't no crack in this block. Your oil is clean, no coolant, no metal shavings. The engine didn't hydro-lock. What happened was your exhaust gas recirculation valve stuck open, melting a cheap $30 wiring harness right next to the high-pressure fuel line. But the tractor shut down. It won't start. Because the melted harness grounded out the main 5-volt reference wire." Caleb explained, his eyes narrowing. "When that happened, the computer lost its mind. It threw a ghost code for a catastrophic failure and triggered a proprietary software kill switch. It's planned obsolescence, Arthur. They engineered this machine to commit suicide so Sterling Ag could force you into a new lease." Arthur stared at him, a mix of relief and terror washing over him. "Can you fix it?" Caleb looked at the massive machine, then out at the dark, freezing clouds rolling in over the horizon. "Mechanically, I can bypass the melted harness and cap the valve in 3 hours. But the computer is locked out. Sterling has the digital keys, and they ain't gonna give 'em up. We have to hotwire a $500,000 rolling server." By Wednesday morning, word had leaked. In a small farming town like Oak Haven, secrets die fast, especially when they involve Richard Sterling and his dealership. The local diner was buzzing with whispers that Caleb Montgomery, the town's eccentric grease monkey, was out in the Pendleton field trying to resurrect a dead quad track. The right to repair movement was a sore subject in Oak Haven. For years, farmers had watched their profit margins shrink as corporate dealerships locked them out of repairing their own equipment. You couldn't even change a transmission filter on a new machine without a dealer technician typing in an authorization code. Resentment had been brewing like a pressure cooker, and Caleb's defiant stand was the spark. At 10 a.m., the Sterling Ag Solutions trucks returned to the field. This time, Richard Sterling and Blake Henderson brought a flatbed trailer and a tow rig, fully intending to haul the scrap away and force Arthur's hand. They found Caleb standing on top of the massive tractor's hood, a portable generator humming nearby. He had spliced into the tractor's main wiring harness and was painstakingly soldering a custom-built circuit board salvaged from a 1990s combine directly into the modern machine's lifeblood. "Hey, get the hell off that machine, old man," Blake shouted, stepping out of the truck. "You're voiding the warranty." Caleb didn't stop soldering. "Warranty expired 3 days ago, kid," which is awfully convenient timing for a fatal computer crash, don't you think? Richard Sterling marched through the mud, his face flushed with anger. "Arthur, I have the lease papers for the 9RX right here. Sign them, and we haul this junk away. If you let this hack mechanic fry the remaining modules, I won't even give you the 40,000. You'll have nothing." Arthur stood his ground, gripping his grandfather's old pocket watch in his coat. "Caleb says the block ain't cracked, Richard. He says you lied." Blake let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "He's a dinosaur arty. He doesn't understand modern CAN bus architecture. The ECU requires a proprietary digital handshake from our servers to disengage the immobilizer. You can't weld a computer virus away. He's going to burn your tractor to the ground." Caleb finally lowered his soldering iron. He climbed down from the hood, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, and walked right up to Blake. Despite being 30 years older, Caleb had the broad, intimidating shoulders of a man who spent his life bending steel. "I'll tell you what I understand, boy," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "I understand that your company put a kill switch in a man's livelihood. You charge 80 grand to replace an engine that ain't broke just to meet a quarterly quota." "Prove it," Blake sneered, stepping closer. "You think you're so smart? Prove it. You'll never get that engine to turn over without my laptop. Never." Caleb's eyes flashed. "Care to make a wager on that, kid?" Richard Sterling scoffed. "We don't bet with Mechanics Montgomery. If I can't get this tractor running and pulling a grain cart by sundown tomorrow, before the blizzard hits Arthur, signs your lease, and I will personally pay the tow bill," Caleb declared, his voice carrying over the wind. "But if I do fire it up, Sterling Ag Solutions pays off the remaining 400,000 on Arthur's note, and you admit in writing that your diagnostics are a fraud." The field went dead silent. Arthur's jaw dropped. It was an insane, impossible bet. Blake looked at Richard, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He knew the software. He knew it was encrypted with military-grade security. It was a guaranteed win, a chance to bankrupt a nuisance mechanic and secure a massive sale. "You're on, old man," Blake laughed. "I'll even bring the popcorn." They didn't shake on it. They didn't need to. In Oakhaven, a bet made in the dirt was as binding as a contract drawn in blood. Within an hour of the Sterling trucks leaving, the CB radios across the county were lit up like fireworks. The wager spread from farm to farm, diner to feed store. Caleb Montgomery was taking on the dealership. He was fighting the very software lockouts that had been choking the life out of independent farmers for a decade. By 2 p.m., the first pickup started arriving at the edge of the Pendleton field. It was just 5 at First Neighbors bringing hot coffee and sandwiches. But by 4 p.m., as the temperature plummeted and Caleb began manually remachining a high-pressure fuel injector valve on a portable lathe in the back of his truck, there were 50 farmers standing in the cold. They brought floodlights, setting them up around the dead tractor so Caleb could work through the night. They brought tarps to shield him from the biting wind. There were men who had lost their farms to similar dealership tactics, men who had been forced into early retirement, and young farmers drowning in debt. By nightfall, the crowd had swelled to over 100. The field looked like a rock concert, illuminated by the harsh white glare of portable halogen lights. The quiet hum of a dozen generators filled the air. Caleb didn't speak to them. He remained entirely focused, a surgeon operating on a massive steel patient. He had physically bypassed the tractor's main computer, running a secondary wiring loom made from scrap copper and an old John Deere controller he'd pulled from a junkyard. The goal was insane. He was trying to trick the fuel injectors into firing by creating a phantom signal, entirely ignoring the encrypted mainframe. At 3 a.m., a sleek black SUV pulled up to the edge of the crowd. Blake Henderson stepped out, flanked by two other dealership technicians. They had come to watch the old man fail. The farmers parted for them, their stares cold and unforgiving. Blake looked at the chaotic web of wires Caleb had strung across the engine bay and smirked. It looked like a high school science fair project gone wrong. "He's desperate," Blake whispered to his techs. "He's trying to spoof a 12-volt pulse into a common rail system that requires microsecond timing. If he tries to crank it, it's going to detonate." Caleb ignored the whispers. He was exhausted, his fingers bleeding from the cold, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had one chance left before the frost permanently set into the diesel lines. He held up a salvaged, oil-stained relay box, the final piece of his makeshift puzzle, and looked out at the sea of faces watching him in the dark. The real war was about to begin. Dawn broke over Oakhaven, not with sunlight, but with the ominous leaden gray of an approaching blizzard. The temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees. Frost coated the massive rubber tracks of the dead Casa Walmer H quad track, turning it into a frozen monument of corporate greed. Yet the dirt road bordering the Pendleton farm looked like the county fairgrounds. Overnight, the crowd had exploded. Word had reached neighboring counties. Men and women who had fought their own bitter wars with equipment lockouts drove for miles, parking their trucks in the frozen mud. By 7 in the morning, nearly 200 farmers stood shivering in the biting wind, drinking black coffee from thermoses, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They formed a massive silent circle around the tractor. Caleb Montgomery was running on pure adrenaline and black coffee. He had spent the last 12 hours painstakingly stripping the digital nervous system of the $500,000 machine. He had completely severed the connection between the engine control unit and the high-pressure fuel injectors. In its place, a grotesque but brilliant Frankenstein's monster of copper wire, scavenged relays, and analog timers was duct-taped to the engine block. At 8 o'clock, Richard Sterling's black SUV rolled back into the field. This time, Richard didn't look smug. He looked nervous. The sight of 200 local farmers, his entire customer base staring daggers at him, made his immaculate suit feel entirely too thin. Blake Henderson, however, still wore his arrogant smirk, clutching his Panasonic Toughbook like a shield. "Time's up, Arthur," Richard called out, trying to project authority over the low hum of portable generators. "The snow starts in 2 hours. Sign the lease, and we haul this scrap away before it's buried until spring." Arthur stood next to his tractor, his face pale and drawn from a sleepless night. He looked up at Caleb, who was currently hanging halfway over the massive front grille, tightening a bolt on the fuel rail. "We ain't done, Richard," Arthur yelled back, his voice surprisingly steady. "The bet stands," Blake scoffed loudly, ensuring the crowd could hear him. "This is pathetic. Look at that wiring job." He's trying to fire piezoelectric injectors with a salvaged relay board from a 1998 combine. The voltage spike alone will fry the harness, assuming the immobilizer doesn't completely lock the transmission first. It's physically impossible. Caleb slid down from the hood. His face was a mask of grease soot and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a fierce, terrifying clarity. He didn't say a word to Blake. He walked straight to the cab of the tractor and climbed the steel steps. The crowd held its collective breath. 200 people fell dead silent. The only sound was the howling prairie wind. Caleb settled into the driver's seat. He reached down to the makeshift control box he had wired directly through the firewall and into the cab. He flipped 3 toggle switches. A low analog hum vibrated from the engine bay. "He's bypassed the ignition," an old farmer whispered in the crowd. Caleb pressed the heavy rubber starter button he had wired in. The massive starter motor engaged. The heavy diesel engine turned over sluggish in the bitter cold. Inside the cab, the digital dashboard violently flashed red. "Critical error. Immobilizer engaged. Do not operate." The tractor's computer was fighting back, desperately trying to shut down the unauthorized commands. Rar. Hiss. The engine coughed out a pathetic puff of white smoke and died. Silence descended on the field again. Blake let out a barking laugh, clapping his hands together. "There it is. The software caught your little bypass, old man. It just shut down the fuel pump relay. You're done. Game over." Arthur's shoulders slumped. He buried his face in his hands. It was over. The farm was gone. Caleb didn't move from the cab. He stared at the flashing digital dashboard, his mind racing. Blake was right about one thing: the main ECU was still managing to cut the fuel supply from the tank. Caleb had bypassed the injectors, but he hadn't bypassed the low-pressure lift pump in the rear. The computer was starving the engine. Caleb ripped the dashboard panel off with his bare hands, ignoring the sharp crack of snapping plastic. He traced the bundle of wires running to the rear chassis. He needed continuous 12-volt power to that pump completely isolated from the CAN bus network. "Arthur," Caleb barked, leaning out the cab window. "Get in my truck. Behind the driver's seat, there's a spool of heavy-gauge marine wire and a pair of jumper cables." "Run." Arthur's head snapped up. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in his chest. He sprinted toward Caleb's rusted F250. "You're just embarrassing yourself now," Richard Sterling shouted, looking nervously at the angry crowd. "This is dangerous. Stop him." Nobody moved to stop him. In fact, old man Higgins, a retired dairy farmer with hands like leather baseball mitts, stepped casually in front of Richard, blocking his path to the tractor. "Let the man work, Dick," Higgins rumbled softly. Arthur returned chest-heaving, handing the heavy wire to Caleb. For the next 20 minutes, Caleb worked with frantic precision. He ran a direct hot wire from the tractor's massive dual batteries straight over the roof of the cab and spliced it directly into the fuel lift pump at the rear tank, wrapping the exposed connection in an excessive amount of electrical tape. He climbed back into the cab. "All right, Arthur," Caleb yelled over the wind. "The computer is going to throw every code it has. The dash is going to look like a Christmas tree. But I've hot-wired the fuel pump, and my analog board is controlling the injectors. We are completely off the grid." Caleb looked at the crowd. 200 faces weathered by years of sun debt and broken promises stared back at him. They weren't just waiting for a tractor to start. They were waiting for a victory against a system designed to break them. He looked at Blake, who was shaking his head, confident the machine was a permanent brick. "Listen to me, you beautiful piece of iron," Caleb muttered, slapping the steering wheel. "Don't you let them win." He flipped the toggle switches. The direct-wired lift pump whined loudly from the rear, a continuous mechanical buzzing that bypassed the computer entirely. Fuel was flowing. He hit the starter button. The engine cranked. The dashboard screamed in digital agony, flashing catastrophic failure warnings. The immobilizer sent repeated shutdown signals into the void, finding no components left to command. Cough. A thick plume of gray smoke shot out of the exhaust stack. The engine hesitated, fighting the cold, fighting the thick oil, fighting its own programming. "Come on!" Arthur screamed from the dirt. Caleb slammed his hand against the makeshift injector timing dial he had wired in advancing the mechanical pulse by a fraction of a second. Boom! The first cylinder caught with the force of a shotgun blast. Boom! 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 The massive 12, 9-liter 6-cylinder engine violently shuddered, belching a massive cloud of thick black diesel soot high into the freezing sky. The wind caught the soot, blowing it directly over Richard Sterling and Blake Henderson, coating their expensive jackets in a layer of greasy black ash. And then the chaotic explosion smoothed out into a deep, rhythmic, thunderous roar. The beast was alive. The sound hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the field erupted. 200 farmers screamed, cheered, and threw their heavy winter caps into the mud. Truck horns began blaring in a deafening, chaotic symphony of triumph. Men who hadn't spoken in years were hugging each other. Arthur Pendleton fell to his knees in the frozen mud, tears streaming down his face, his hands raised to the gray sky. Caleb sat in the cab, the heavy vibrations of the massive engine rattling his teeth. A slow, exhausted smile cracked through the grease on his face. He throttled the engine up. The tractor roared louder, a defiant war cry echoing across the Iowa plains. He put his foot on the heavy clutch, grabbed the gear selector, and slammed it into forward drive. The transmission mechanically linked and indifferent to the screaming computer, engaged with a heavy clunk. Caleb let out the clutch. The 4 massive rubber tracks bit deep into the frozen mud. With zero hesitation, the $500,000 machine lurched forward, dragging the massive, fully loaded grain cart behind it as easily as a child pulling a wagon. He drove it in a wide, triumphant circle around the perimeter of the field, the engine purring with perfect mechanical precision. When he finally brought it back to the center of the crowd and idled, the engine down, the cheering was so loud it drowned out the approaching storm. Caleb killed the engine, opened the heavy glass door, and stepped out onto the metal platform. He looked down at Richard Sterling and Blake Henderson. Blake was staring at the tractor with wide, horrified eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. His laptop had completely frozen, incapable of processing how the machine was running without its permission. Richard was pale, the color completely drained from his face beneath the layer of diesel soot. Caleb slowly climbed down the steps. The crowd parted for him, treating him with the silent, awestruck reverence of a conquering general. He walked right up to the dealership owner and wiped his greasy right hand on a rag. "She pulls just fine, Richard," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the lingering cheers. "Seems the block wasn't cracked after all, just a bad wire and a lying computer." Richard swallowed hard. He looked at Arthur, then at Caleb, and finally at the 200 angry, vindicated farmers surrounding him. There was nowhere to hide. "The bet," Arthur said, stepping forward, his voice ringing with newfound iron. $400,000, paid in full to the bank by tomorrow morning, and a signed admission that your diagnostics were fraudulent. You can't be serious." Richard stammered, his eyes darting around. That was just talk." Deputy Miller, the county sheriff, who happened to farm 300 acres of soybeans on the side, stepped out from the front row of the crowd. He rested his hand casually on his duty belt. "I heard a verbal contract, Richard. A wager made in public. Hell, I think there's about 200 witnesses here who heard the exact same thing." The crowd murmured in dark agreement. A few men took a step forward, crossing their arms. Richard Sterling looked at the faces of the men who bought his equipment, paid his exorbitant service fees, and kept his business alive. He knew in that instant, if he reneged on this bet, he would never sell so much as a spark plug in Oak Haven County ever again. The right to repair movement had just found its holy grail, and it was parked in Arthur Pendleton's field. "Fine," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll draw up the paperwork." He turned and practically ran to his SUV, dragging a shell-shocked Blake behind him. As their tires spun in the mud, fleeing the field, the crowd erupted into cheers once more. The first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the giant grease-covered tractor in a layer of pristine white. Arthur walked up to Caleb and grabbed him in a crushing embrace. "How can I ever repay you, Caleb?" Arthur choked out. Caleb patted the younger man on the back and stepped away, grabbing his canvas bag of analog tools. "Just get your corn in the bins, Arthur, before the snow gets too deep." As Caleb walked back to his rusted truck, fading into the swirling snow, the legend of the mechanic who beat the machine was already being written into the folklore of the American heartland. He hadn't just fixed a tractor, he had broken the lock on a whole way of life. If this story of an underdog fighting back against corporate greed got your blood pumping, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a true mechanical victory, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories from the heartland. Let us know in the comments, have you ever had to outsmart a broken system